Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. In today's episode, we're going to start off by unpacking some of the stuff that we've brought back from that chunk that we mined out and the ancient city. We've got a bunch of books in here, some of which I want to apply to various things. We've got Unbreaking to put on this hoe, which I have now freshly repaired, and we have a bunch of Swift Sneak books, and we're going to put Swift Sneak 3 on my current set of diamond leggings. All of the ore blocks that we brought back from that chunk are just going to go straight into the storage system, since all of the ores will be sorted by the ore section that I have already down there. So I'm just going to throw all of this in here. We're going to do that manually so that the shulker box will be freed up. And the system down there is sorting the most common sets of ores, so I'm fairly certain that stuff like the deep slate coal ore is going to end up in our overflow chest, but I might reposition that over there once this is done sorting through everything and we can put this shulker box back away. Now let's go to our enchanting setup, and we've got an anvil up there with which we should be able to imbue some of our existing gear with this brand new set of enchantments we've got. So that hoe can finally have Unbreaking, and aside from needing efficiency 5, that is a pretty decent hoe at this point. We got Mending and Unbreaking 3 on there, so that's going to last for the longest a tool possibly can. And we need to remove our leggings to get hold of Swift Sneak 3, which is going to be fairly expensive, but definitely worthwhile. I explained the way Swift Sneak works in the previous episode, but just to catch you folks up, the way this works is that if you're walking around normally when you sneak, you take a little bit of a decrease in speed. So for example, without these leggings on, I'm sneaking a lot slower than I would be walking or sprinting. With Swift Sneak on, however, it doesn't reduce your movement speed nearly as much when you sneak. Here is the difference between me walking around. You can see my arm bobbing up and down like that, and now I'm sneaking. My arm is still, and I'm moving at more or less the same speed. Now, one of the other fun aspects of this is that if you are sprinting before you start sneaking, your sneak speed is faster than it normally would be from a walking sneak. So you can actually tech this a little bit. You can end up jumping between sneaks and still gliding around like this a little bit faster than you would otherwise. And I'm not sure if this is still the case, but thanks to a weird combination of Minecraft physics, swift sneaking on a diagonal might actually be faster than sprinting in that direction. It certainly feels very fast. But we're going to be swift sneaking from now on thanks to these fancy new leggings I've acquired, and I don't know, I think I'll get used to it after a while, but it's always one of those things like Depth Strider, where if you've not had Depth Strider for a while and then you get it again, you suddenly have to get used to getting faster in water. But having Swift Sneak is actually going to be really useful for us today because we're going to do a little bit of building. In fact, we're going to keep with the scary theme, but a little bit outside the box of just scary mobs to fight and scary Minecraft features. Today, we're going to be building with scary blocks. I've had this mud farm set up for a while, but it's looked very bare bones out here in the open, and I want to turn this into a sort of mud factory. I can also make a couple of quick changes to the way this works mechanically speaking, because I figure we can put a hopper minecart in the top here to avoid any issues with the glass bottles inside of this dispenser being spat out in a weird angle. And thankfully we have a hopper minecart left over from our Allay clock setup, so we're just going to use that up the top here. We're going to put the rail on top of this hopper, and since rails can be waterlogged, that's absolutely no problem. The only other thing we need to do to this farm is make sure that it's got enough glass bottles in here that they don't all end up stacking up and leaving one stack empty, so that the water bottles end up being retained by this dispenser. But now we've got decent trade connections and plenty of sand we can convert into glass. I think we should be able to do that no problem. So the task that remains is to build with the blocks that you're scared of, and that's one of the topics I wanted to approach in this series, is why people like and dislike certain types of blocks. I think it really comes down to neutrality and usability for the most part. Like, if you think about the light grey range of blocks here, like stone, for example. Stone has a very neutral texture to it. It doesn't have anything that really gives it that high contrast, standout texture the way something like cobblestone has. So it's very easy to build large stuff out of stone. I mean, you see it all of the time in terrain around here, and the terrain never looks like it stands out. Like, it never looks too busy because it's all sculpted out of natural material like stone. On the other hand, if you're applied a texture like cobblestone to every stone block in the game, it would look incredibly busy and might be a little bit harsh on the eyes. With this amount of contrast in the texture of cobblestone, players don't tend to build entire walls out of cobblestone if they want something to look particularly nice, because it doesn't really leave anywhere for the eye to rest. You're looking at a lot of busy texture, and that actually tends to tire the eyes out after a while. But despite that, peppering a little bit of cobblestone into a build like this can add some texture to the wall and imply that there are different materials at play here, that the wall isn't just made out of stone. Or alternatively, it can imply something a little bit like how cartoonists and illustrators use texture. Just add a little bit of it and it tricks the brain into thinking that entire wall is probably made out of that material, but they've just chosen to pepper in a couple of details for examples. The other thing about grey is that it's a neutral color, kind of similar to black and white. It can be paired with a lot of things without clashing, without creating uncomfortable looking combinations of colors. Like if you were to build an entire house out of red and green material or out of orange and cyan material, those colors clash quite a lot and you'd end up with something that felt a little bit too cartoonish. In the case of red and green, probably evoking that kind of Christmas palette, but orange and cyan next to each other all over the place takes a very specific type of build in order to pull that off. If you're looking to build a naturalistic house like this, you're probably not going to want to build it out of orange and cyan materials. But there are some materials that, historically speaking, players don't always get on with, and I'm looking specifically at materials like granite and diorite. People don't like these materials because they have a little bit of a busy texture. The clean calcite here that we have alongside the diorite feels a lot nicer to look at. It's kind of the diorite equivalent of natural stone, where the diorite is closer to something like cobblestone in terms of how busy the texture is, how many light areas and dark areas there are, creating contrast within the texture of that block. With granite, the texture is a little bit contrasty. There are some darker and lighter areas in this, but I think the main thing people dislike about granite is the color. It's this non-committal, sickly kind of pinkish orange that doesn't really stand out as an accent color, but it's difficult to have it work together with other blocks in the block palette because there are very few materials that really harmonize with this kind of color. And those that do either create even more contrast, like right here where I've got it next to dripstone. Dripstone kind of has a slightly more purpley tinge to it than granite, but it's a warmer set of colors. It's meant to be kind of a warmer, drier type of material, and they're sort of related, but this texture looks very different to that texture, and they are both very distinct. They're both kind of noisy in their own ways, but where dripstone is kind of streaky in a horizontal way, granite feels kind of more random and cracked and organic. Then again, if you compare granite to terracotta, if you look at these two textures, they're fairly similar in color, but the terracotta has such a lack of detail, even though there is a little bit of texture in there if you look a little bit closer, but that has such a plain texture from a distance compared to the granite, which is always going to stand out. So it can be a little bit difficult to find places in which to use granite, and that is why granite remains one of the blocks that I probably use the least out of the entire Minecraft block palette. Today we are going to change that, and we're going to change it by using granite as one of several colors in a gradient that's going to form the walls of our mud block factory. You see, this all ties in together. We're also going to spend some time with one of my other least favorite blocks in the game, and that is, surprisingly, the bricks block. And I think brick blocks are actually the perfect choice to put in the build around a mud factory for a couple of reasons. First of all, brick blocks to me really represent that kind of old school factory style building that there are a lot of in the UK. Mills and workshops and stuff that was built around the era of the Industrial Revolution here in the UK. And you find bricks like this in the walls of a great deal of UK houses because we have a lot of clay. Having access to materials like this naturally means that we can create a lot of building material using them. But the problem I have always had with the Minecraft brick texture, even after they revised some of these textures back in the 1.14 update, is that it's so plain. Every brick in this texture is exactly the same, give or take a couple of pixels here and there, but for the most part, all of the bricks are the same color, they have basically the same shading, and that's not really how bricks are in the real world. Maybe if a brand new build has been put down and the bricks are fresh and new and it's like a new residential area that they want to have a nice clean look to it, you'll find that a lot of those bricks look the same. But bricks in a building that's been there for longer than maybe a year or two will start to develop their own character. They'll develop different color as they age and the elements affect them, and that is not present at all in the default Minecraft brick texture. Some people get around this by developing a resource pack or using somebody else's resource pack that changes up the colors of bricks and makes them a little bit more randomized, but that doesn't necessarily jive with my way of working because I want to make the blocks of the default resource pack look good in the builds that I make. That's part of the challenge of Minecraft for me. That's part of the puzzle. And so the way I want to make bricks look good is by pairing them with other materials. Instead of putting the gradient in the roof of this build, we're going to be putting it into the wall and keeping the roof plain so that, as I said before, the eye has somewhere to rest. When your walls are going to be this colorful, you want to have something a bit neutral. But if you look at granite and bricks side by side, they are not exactly the same color. The granite is lighter, it's a little bit pale, there's not quite the contrast that the bricks have, and it's obviously much less structured of a block. If you put blocks of bricks side by side, the mortar in between the bricks lines up the bricks themselves, continue on over into the next block. If you throw a piece of granite in there, it really doesn't look like it should work very well. But one of the mysteries of Minecraft building, one of the things that makes this a little bit strange, is that a single wall of bricks like this can look relatively bland, whereas if you start to pepper in a little bit of granite, maybe we'll do this along one edge like so, and have some of the granite feel like the bricks have worn down and it's maybe been patched up with other building materials and some filler has been put in over time. Suddenly you find that this wall takes on a bit of its own character. And if we fly away from this and look at it from a distance, the colors will start to merge into one overall color. It's kind of difficult to demonstrate this when obviously this is going to look really small for you folks watching the video, but the way this brick wall appears from a distance, it sort of like merges all of the colors together. So despite the fact that those materials look like they clash so much up close, at a distance, they start to look like a harmonious piece of the same chunk of material, basically. And that's what we're going to be doing with this factory wall. We're going to have some granite and brick next to each other, accompanied by a bunch of other textures, and you'll be interested to see what actually stands out when all's said and done. And at the same time, we get to use two blocks that I've never really liked all that much and turn them into a build that I am pretty certain I'm going to enjoy. So here's the plan. We brought back a bunch of moss from that moss mining chunk that we did over there in the mountain biome, and I want to use a bunch of this to kind of blend this build in with the surroundings. But how do we get from this, the moss block over here, to this, where we've got the bricks and we've got the granite? How do we bridge the gap between these two without making it look like the Christmas color palette I mentioned? How do we stop green and red from clashing this much? The answer, of course, is to throw in some sort of gradient, and we're going to work with a combination of blocks that both share some colors with these, but also share some thematic parallels, or at least some material parallels. The first of those is going to be mossy cobblestone, and gosh, is this all the cobblestone I have? Okay, I need to do some more mining, apparently, because mossy cobblestone is a vital bridge between the green and grey palettes, because of course moss and mossy cobblestone are going to go together quite nicely. In addition to that, I think tuff is a really great block to use alongside mossy cobblestone, because it starts to bridge into that grey colour palette even further, while still having a couple of those darker areas that feel a little bit greener or yellower in the texture, and that really helps to blend between these materials without looking like it's kind of unnatural. Where the shift really comes in, though, is in the copper color palette, which right now we don't have a huge amount of additional copper around, so we're probably going to have to lay out some of this in order for it to oxidize. And really the best way to do that is to make sure the copper blocks are spaced 4 blocks apart, so they have 4 blocks in between each of these 2 blocks, and on every 5th block you're placing another block of copper. Of course, make sure it's not waxed before you do this. It will say waxed in the item name, or you can right click it with an X, just tap it once to make sure that the wax has been removed if there was any in the first place. And naturally, the more copper you leave out to age like this, the faster you will find a single block that ages. So we're going to grab one of those, we're going to leave the rest of these to age a couple more stages, and I'm going to find my stone cutter, because the stone cutter is vital for turning copper blocks into some of their variants, of which we are getting a lot more in the next update, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, if you want cut copper, you can get 4 blocks of it from a single block of copper in a stone cutter, whereas if you use a crafting interface, you're putting 4 blocks in to get 4 blocks out. Back in the stone cutter, if you put 4 blocks in, you'd be getting 16 blocks out, so naturally the cut copper from the stone cutter is going to be a lot more value per block than it is crafting it in a crafting table. That's really one of the golden rules of working with copper, is that you should always cut your copper in a stone cutter. Now, a couple more of these blocks are transforming before our very eyes, so we're going to wait for one of those to get to the weathered stage, from this exposed color to the weathered color. And while it's doing that, we're going to get hold of some vines. Even if you don't have a jungle or a swamp nearby, vines can be pretty easy to farm. You've just got to bring 4 saplings for jungle trees out here, bone meal those until the tree grows if you can't wait for it to grow naturally, and they'll generate with a ton of vines on that you can then shear off. Vines will also allow you to craft mossy cobblestone if you want to, but we're going to use them to ease the transition between the greener blocks and the slightly less green blocks in our color palette. But at last, one of our copper blocks has reached the weathered copper stage, so we're going to grab that, we're going to cut that in our stone cutter as well, and we'll finally be able to put together the full block palette for this wall. So more or less, this is what we're going to be working with. We start off with some moss, we add a bit of mossy cobblestone, and then tuff on top of that. We're going to switch then to weathered cut copper, which is going to be kind of a shift from the greener blocks down here, but we're going to add some vines over the top of that for at least 1 block. Then we're going to have some exposed cut copper on the top of that to have that transition between the pinkish green to the greenish pink. From there we can transition into a block of granite, and from there we end up finishing the wall with bricks. And if I hop down here, I think this is honestly a really cool set of transitions. We can even have the vines overlay the tuff blocks a little bit, and that can connect the tuff to the mossy cobblestone even more, whilst also providing a transition between the tuff and the weathered copper. We've got our bricks in there prominently, we've got a layer of granite, and we're not going to make this a linear gradient like we've done in the roofs here. It's not just going to be rows of these blocks identically all the way along. We are going to mix and match the materials in here to imply that the moss has grown up the wall here in more organic patterns, and that it's not just sitting at the bottom of the wall curated that way. The idea that the factory has been sort of naturalized or overgrown by the foliage of the area is quite appealing to me, and so I think it's kind of worth mixing in a bunch of the moss and whatnot. Maybe having a couple of areas where the moss hasn't even grown up a certain section of the wall, but maybe have it in the floor instead, and we can start to blend these transitions together, even using leaves over the top if we want to have a bit more 3D to this wall, because it's going to be a big flat wall, but with this amount of texture in it, you're really not going to notice that from a distance. It's going to create such a different impression to a wall that is just made out of flat sections of brick, and this is one of the essential things I think to learn about building in Minecraft, is that there are these kind of painterly brush strokes you can apply to texturing builds, instead of having to make it all out of one type of material. But at this point, in order to complete our wall here and work a little bit more on the wider structure, I'm going to need to wait for more of this copper to age. So I'm going to make sure that we've smelted enough of that we can lay out a bunch of the copper blocks in this grid, and we'll see what we can do when we've gotten hold of more of it. Okay, with a bit more thought and effort and a little bit more copper, we've now got a wall together, and I've decided to add mud into the mix. Packed mud specifically, because this is actually quite a diverse block. Once we have the regular packed mud in there, we can also change it up if we want to and add some mud bricks to line up with some of the tiled textures that we've got in here from the copper. Not only that, but we can also include some mossy stone bricks in areas that we want to feel a little bit more structural. And I'm planning on pulling a wall out by a block every so often to create a kind of supporting pillar, which could even end up being a factory chimney depending on how we design the rest of the build. Another really important tip for working with copper, though, if you have a single block of copper that you know you're going to turn into cut copper, wax it first, because that will preserve the age of that individual copper block, but it will also keep the wax when you cut it into cut copper. So you end up with 4 blocks of waxed, weathered cut copper in this case, instead of having to spend 4 honeycomb waxing it. That will save you on honeycomb if you don't have a substantial farm for the stuff. Although, right now, the farm is absolutely churning out stuff and I have no real use for it besides this. So any blocks of copper that I want to keep in that state, I've been waxing first, then mining, and then cutting in the stone cutter. Another tip to give you in terms of harvesting vines, just to make things things a little bit faster is that vines can actually be harvested quicker if you have a set of shears enchanted with efficiency. Now, if you've done a bit of experimental enchanting already, you will know that efficiency can't simply be put on shears in an enchantment table. What you need to do instead is gather some efficiency books, and I should have some around here, but maybe I haven't used them all that much. We'll use this one since I'm not interested in having Bane of Arthropods or knockback on anything. Let's add efficiency 4 to these shears. We can also add mending as well, so that the durability on these doesn't matter, because we can just go and repair them, add an experience farm, and obviously we can add unbreaking once I've got an unbreaking book available. But you can actually shear vines a lot faster with efficiency, and efficiency 4 is definitely enough to shear these vines instantaneously, meaning that if you're farming them from jungle trees, you can just grab a bunch all at once like this, instead of having to mine them one at a time individually and have that take up a bunch of your time and effort. But now we've got a bunch of copper on the go. The mud is nice and easy to acquire. We are literally farming it inside the building that we're trying to make right now, and the wheat farm over there is providing enough that we can convert it into packed mud. The next thing to figure out is a source of bricks, and while of course we could end up drying off all of the mud here, turning it into clay, and then smelting the individual clay balls, we can also get bricks from villagers, and so we're going to go and pay a visit to a stonemason. The XP that we earn from trading will actually be a really good way of repairing these shears, so we can buy bricks 10 per emerald, which is actually a really nice way of gathering bricks for blocks. That's 40 blocks of bricks per trading refresh, so we should be able to end up with 120 bricks, nearly 2 stacks of bricks per day, which is really not too bad when the alternative is making clay yourself or going and digging it all out of riverbeds and lush caves. And there we go, we've got our 2 stacks of bricks from the stonemason. That's enough to keep us going on the factory build for now. Let's head on home. And we're going to follow the pattern that we've established with some other builds in this area, trying to tie this build in thematically, even though it's using a very different block palette, by using this alternating pattern of spruce, logs, and slabs that we've been using to support the roof structure. Once we've got that in place, we can add a couple of rows of deep slate tiles, and with those we can even do the 1.5 block roof pitch that we've used elsewhere in this area, because of course deep slate tiles have a nice easy slab we can add. And we can maybe add a little bit of texture to this roof later, but for now I think with the wall looking this textured, it helps to have the roof made out of a single type of block, and the deep slate tiles are going to look nice and industrial for our factory build. I'm bringing all of these materials in a shulker box that I can just stash in my inventory and pull blocks out of as we need them, and that way we can work on this build in sections instead of cluttering our inventory with all of the stuff that we don't need right now. So we'll bring this out 1 block for our first supporting pillar. We'll add a couple of mossy cobblestone, being kind of sparing with that right now since I don't have too much of the block, but we'll add the tuff in as we go, then switch to the weathered copper, add a couple of vines down the outside, and pay attention to how those grow, by the way, because we might need to block them off or trim them a little bit later. Since this chimney part is supposed to be the thing supporting the structure, we'll say it's built to last, and we'll add some mud bricks in here instead of the packed mud block. Then we'll transition up into granite like so, and then we'll add the bricks on the sides like this. We want the same structure of supporting blocks, so we are still going to add the spruce and the slabs over the top, but then coming out from the top of here, I'm probably going to use a different material for the chimney. Let's say we probably don't want it to be spruce wood, maybe something like acacia, since that continues into a more reddish orange block palette. And I'm talking about stripped acacia specifically, so that we get that nice orange color coming out of it, and maybe giving sort of a corally pinky orange to go with the brick texture below. It might just work. One thing's for sure, it's a pretty stark contrast with the roof next door, so we'll see how we feel about that later. Maybe we'll make it out of bricks or something instead, but for now it really stands out. I guess I'll wait to see if it feels any better with another section of wall alongside this, but we also want to work in a couple of little areas like windows in some of this, just to give the whole thing a bit of depth and make it feel like some light could get into the building. We don't want it to be all solid walls, and for that I think acacia trapdoors are going to work out super well. We have a 9 block wide section of wall here, so we want to leave a central pillar, but we're going to knock out a couple of apertures in the wall here. We're going to leave 3x2 windows in here. We can hop on through and we can add some acacia trapdoors to the back half of these. And you know what? Maybe we can invert the ones below so that the catch isn't just in the center of the window here. Let's do the same for these ones. And since we're doing that behind the window and not in the window, we can actually frame this out with some slabs of granite, like so. And maybe we'll add a couple more blocks of granite around the top here, just so it doesn't feel like that material comes out of nowhere. And I think halfway up this wall, we could even mirror the same spruce log supporting pattern with the slabs in between. And that'd give this a nice kind of halfway up the wall supporting shelf kind of thing. And there we go. That kind of adds an industrial feel to the place, doesn't it? Especially with the vertical slats in the windows. I think those work out quite well. See, this is coming together, and the top floor of this is made almost exclusively out of blocks that I don't really like the look of when they're considered on their own. But when you combine them, they actually end up adding to this industrial feel in kind of a big way. And from further away especially, you don't really see the individual materials. What you see is green and grey down there and pink at the top there. And I think that really works for the bricks that are going to be standing out against the granite there. The mud bricks, if anything, make a kind of standout texture because they have quite a high contrast between the lines in between that delineate the bricks and the relatively plain texture themselves. But honestly, that's not looking too bad. The main thing I've got to work on now is structure. Since I like these sticking out pillars, obviously we're going to have a couple more of those separating these 9-block long sections of wall, and that's a pattern we can repeat, so we can get that down pretty easily at this point. The main thing to consider is, since this has to house our mud machine, how long versus how wide is this going to be? Are we going to add anything different to the shape to keep it interesting, or are we just going to leave it to be relatively boxy, just kind of 4 walls surrounding this machine? I might want to leave a little bit of space in here, since we might add a piston feed tape in future that can transfer the mud up onto floors where it can dry out into clay. And once we've harvested the clay, we could turn that into terracotta and bricks and all sorts of other stuff besides. But I think for now, I'll stick with building a large box shape around this structure, and then we'll see if we can add on a couple of outbuildings and bits and pieces that are going to give 1 or 2 of these walls a bit more character. Hey folks, welcome back. So, after a little bit of time, I am fairly happy with this build, although I will admit I was on the struggle bus for a while with this one. I had built that wall, wrapped it around, and I decided to mirror that on the opposite side, trying to center the mud-making mechanism as much as possible. So we had this 9-wide section here in the center that I really wasn't all that sure what to do with. I wanted to make a third pointed roof amidst all of this, but it just didn't look right to have these 3 like archways basically at the front of the building. So instead what I did was I built this kind of flat factory facade just using brick blocks. And even though this seems like a lot of bricks, I've decided that it's actually not too bad just because we can fit in a variety of shapes. And that is one of the other things that you can do with blocks like this, as long as they have enough variety of shape that you can work with them on the scale that you're working with, is build out some sort of interesting silhouette with the blocks instead of relying on texture. We might work in a couple more granite details into this to make it feel like the factory facade is a little bit more worn down, but I kind of liked the idea of having this more formed archway over the top of the whole thing. And on the inside, it doesn't actually look too bad to have this sort of brick tower at the top and then continue an arched roof out from that. So I'll give you a look at this from the outside. On the opposite side of this, it's basically an identical wall. I copied the window and the windows that I put into the roof. And then up here, I have a couple of brick chimneys just rising out of the entire thing with campfires as though they are smoking from some sort of industry inside. And if we take a look from up here, you'll see that there is a third roof that just comes out from the side of that, and a flat roof of deep slate tile slabs right here. And while this does feel relatively modern compared to the other constructions here in this area, I've decided not to go with a specific build style. If we do some thematic building where all of the builds look like they have to come from the same era, then we'll do that elsewhere, and we'll make like a specific type of town. We'll make a medieval town or a desert civilization or some sort of modern city or something like that, and we'll try and do some thematic building so we can study a particular style of building in the future. At the back here, you can see what would happen if we did have those 3 peaked roofs at the front. And I think you'll agree that at the front of the building, it wouldn't have looked all that impressive. It might have felt kind of anticlimactic, which is why I think that boxy brick structure works relatively well. At first, I tried doing the same roof pitch for the side roofs and the central roof, but in the end, I made the central roof more shallow so that it could connect to the back of the boxy brick structure at the front. And honestly, I think it's better off that way, not feeling too imposing on the skyline of this place. And so I thought I'd bring you back in for a couple more details that I've cooked up in creative. And obviously right now we don't have a great deal of details to add to the interior. Everything is fairly plain inside here, and it's a large space to decorate. Personally, I would absolutely love to decorate this using some of the newer copper blocks that we're currently testing in the snapshots for Minecraft 1.21, but I don't think we're going to get hold of those in this world for a while. So I might leave the details in here relatively plain so that in future we can come back with those brand new copper and tough blocks and do a little bit of decoration in here. I can imagine using the new copper grates as walkways, but we're not going to get to do that until 1.21 comes out, and I honestly don't know when that will be, but it'll probably be sometime next year. So in the meantime, we can get on to these last two details I had planned, and the first is going to require us to grab a bunch of iron, and we can definitely spare the iron at this point because we have so much of it. We're going to make some chains. We're going to need a bunch of these, so I will just make a whole batch of them here in my inventory. That will probably do for making basically close to a stack of chains, and we're going to turn a bunch of the blocks of iron here into anvils. And these anvils are all going to be used decoratively, which, again, feels kind of weird, but then we have an iron farm. We have a limitless supply of iron. It's currently making more than I am using, and this is honestly going to feel like kind of a cool trick if you haven't seen something like this before. So we're going to grab some string, and we're going to head over to the empty walls of this factory, the two sides where the walls are a little bit flatter, and we're going to make it look like there are anvils dangling from these supporting pillars. I'm not sure why they would be doing this. I don't think they need to counterweight the outside of the building, but I just like it for a little bit of grey detail in here to counteract quite how colourful this is, and to give the impression once again that this is a fairly industrial feeling place. Now, underneath the block where we want to place the anvil, we're going to put some string, and then we can place the anvil on top of that string to make it look like the anvil is balanced in mid-air. And while string clearly has this hitbox if we hover over it with the mouse, if we look away, you'll see that there's only a couple of very faint white pixels, and they are so transparent that from certain angles they are barely noticeable, and especially from a distance, it doesn't look like the string exists at all, and it simply looks like the anvil is floating in mid-air. You can do this with any gravity block that needs some sort of supporting block as long as you have a place that you can put some string. If you put the block directly above it, then it should balance as though it is sat on something even when it isn't. String is useful for a variety of other things as well, including blocking off areas where vines might grow, and so we might actually end up using that on the wall of the factory here, where clearly the vines have gotten out of control. I think I placed maybe 4 or 5 of these per section of wall, and they've grown pretty substantially at this stage. So we're going to block them off from growing any further than that. Although if the string gets a little bit annoying for you and you don't really want it here, then you could always consider coming back and treating this as a vine farm. Every time you need some vines, you don't need to grow a jungle tree, you just need to come back to this build and shear off the vines that you want. Anyway, to complete the illusion here, to make it look like the anvil is supported by something, we're going to build a couple of chains in there, and there you go. It looks like the anvil is being held up by these chains, and we're going to do that underneath several of these wooden support blocks. Keeping the anvils at different heights is going to add some visual interest. I think at one point we're going to have a 2-block length chain, but we're not going to have the anvil dangling from it as though it's fallen off. In fact, we could even put one on the ground. I might just place the anvil against the side of the building here and just let it fall, and it's broken a little bit as well, which is perfect. We'll put the final anvil just here. There we go. That one's rotated a little bit as well, as though it's swinging in the breeze, and if we step back and take a look at this, it adds a little bit of visual interest to the side of the factory here. I do actually really like the detail of the anvil having fallen from that chain and broken slightly. It just looks like something has not entirely gone right about the decision to decorate the outside of this with anvils. We've done the same thing now on the opposite wall of the building, and it really feels like something industrial is happening inside. The last thing I wanted to do is something about this entrance. Feels like it needs a door of some kind, but for an entrance this large, I like to imagine it being a door with a rolling shutter, having something that kind of folds up into the factory space so that large vehicles could make their way through. Pillaring up behind this archway, we're going to build this out of bamboo, and we want to have a few blocks of it visible from the outside, so we're going to start that, I think, here. And bamboo can be placed like a log, it can be placed in multiple different directions, so we get this nice shutter-style horizontal texture to it. And fortunately enough, bamboo planks also have that horizontal texture on the sides, so we don't need to go all the way to stripped bamboo in order to get this done, meaning that we can conserve materials slightly here. And from the outside, obviously, we have to fill in the side walls here, so I'll go ahead and grab some more mossy cobble and tuff just to fill in these spaces. And from the outside, once that's sealed off, I like it. I think we probably need some trapdoors or something for detail so that it feels like it's at least got a mechanism pulling it into the inside of here. Yeah, there we go. I like that. I like the idea of acacia trapdoors feeling slightly more industrial and folding up in sections where those catches are. Seems like a good idea to me. I think on the inside here, we're also going to make it look like the door folds up and over so that it's got some sort of mechanism that makes it horizontal after that. And unfortunately for me, the plank texture on the underside is not going to go in the same direction. It's going to look like the thing reverses direction and is suddenly going that way. But that is where we can take advantage of the rotatable texture that we have from the block of bamboo, where if we strip this with an axe, it becomes stripped bamboo, and you're not going to notice the difference between the texture of this and the bamboo planks if you look at them from the side, but we can control the direction of the texture if we're using the full bamboo blocks. Brilliant. Yeah, that's the impression that I wanted. So the idea that the door kind of rises up and then on some sort of track folds around like that makes perfect sense to me, and I think I've seen a few garage doors that do that, so that works out. We can remove these blocks of moss from the threshold as well, but I think that's all I want to do with this build today. And I think it's safe to say at this point that I've overcome my fear of using bricks. While I think I could add a couple of details to this facade, there aren't really that many other blocks that work with bricks. If I went to another type of brick like stone brick, the brick pattern would stand out a lot. If I went to something that had smaller bricks like nether brick or red nether brick even, those colors would stand out really intensely against this brick palette. So I think honestly we're better leaving it as is, maybe working a little bit of granite for the stairs and slabs, but I think all in all I'm pretty happy with this one. And that's where we're going to leave things for today, folks. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Minecraft Survival Guide. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care, bye for now.